Hello and welcome to Featured Fiction Part 2. If you were here last weekend, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome. This is a show where we all sit down and listen to weird, creepy fiction curated by me. Part 3 will happen tomorrow night, same time, same place. That's right, baby, we're going all weekend. Tonight we have 3 stories by 3 authors. The first story is about 45 minutes long, the second one's about an hour long, and the third one is only a half hour long. But we'll have a 10-minute potty break between each story, so there's no need to wet yourself, unless that's your thing. That's fine. Our first story tonight is called Jeffy is 5. That's Jeffty. And this is a story by Harlan Ellison, who is one of the most ridiculous guys to ever exist. I love Harlan Ellison. I want to have a lot of Harlan Ellison stories on this show in the future. Something I especially love about him is that he narrates a lot of his own stories in audio form. And this version of Jeffy is 5 is narrated by Harlan Ellison. Is a story written about a kid who never grows up. It's written by a guy who was a kid in the late 1940s and early 50s, so keep in mind that he's going to be referencing some shit from 80 years ago, you know, when the world and its media were different than they are today. So look forward to, not understanding everything 100%. That's okay. You don't need to. So, without further ado, Jeffy is 5. Let's go!
Jeffy is 5 by Harlan Ellison. When I was 5 years old, there was a little kid I played with, Jeffy. His real name was Jeff Kinzer, and everyone who played with him called him Jeffy. We were 5 years old together, and we had good times playing together. When I was 5, a Clark bar was as fat around as the gripping end of a Louisville Slugger and pretty nearly 6 inches long, and they used real chocolate to coat it, and it crunched very nicely when you bit into the center. And the paper, it came wrapped and smelled fresh and good when you peeled off one end to hold the bar so it wouldn't melt onto your fingers. Yeah? Today, a Clark bar is as thin as a credit card. They use something artificial and awful tasting instead of pure chocolate. The thing is soft and soggy. It costs 15 or 20 cents instead of a decent correct nickel, and they wrap it so you think it's the same size it was 20 years ago. Only it isn't. It's slim and ugly and nasty tasting and not worth a penny, much less 15 or 20 cents. When I was that age, 5 years old, I was sent away to my Aunt Patricia's home in Buffalo, New York for 2 years. My father was going through bad times, yeah? And Aunt Patricia was very beautiful and had married a stockbroker. And they took care of me for 2 years. And when I was 7, I came back home and went to find Jeffy so we could play together. I was 7. Jeffy was still 5. I didn't notice any difference. I didn't know. I was only 7. When I was 7 years old, I used to lie on my stomach in front of our Atwater Kent radio and listen to swell stuff. I had tied the ground wire to the radiator, and I would lie there with my coloring books and my Crayolas, when there were only 16 colors in the big box. And I'd listen to the NBC Red Network, Jack Benny on the Jell-O program, Amos and Andy, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy on the Chase and Sanborn program, One Man's Family, First Nighter, the NBC Blue Network, Easy Aces, the Juergens program with Walter Winchell, Information Please, Death Valley Days, and best of all, the Mutual Network with the Green Hornet, the Lone Ranger, the Shadow, and Quiet Please. Today, I turn on my car radio and go from one end of the dial to the other, and all I get is 100 strings orchestras, banal housewives, and insipid truckers discussing their kinky sex lives with arrogant talk show hosts, country and western drivel, and rock music so loud it hurts my ears. When I was 10, my grandfather died of old age, and I was a troublesome kid, yeah. So they sent me off to military school so I could be taken in hand. I came back when I was 14. Jeffy was still 5. When I was 14 years old, I used to go to the movies on Saturday afternoons, and a matinee was 10 cents, and they used real butter on the popcorn, and I could always be sure of seeing a Western like Lash LaRue, or Wild Bill Elliott as Red Ryder with Bobby Blake as Little Beaver, or Roy Rogers or Johnny Mac Brown, a scary picture like House of Horrors with Rondo Hatton as the Strangler, or The Cat People, or The Mummy, or I Married a Witch with Frederick March and Veronica Lake, plus an episode of a great serial like The Shadow with Victor Jory or Dick Tracy or Flash Gordon, at 3 cartoons, a James Fitzpatrick travel talk, movie tone news, and a sing-along. And if I stayed on till evening, bingo or keno and free dishes. Today, I go to movies and see Clint Eastwood blowing people's heads apart like ripe cantaloupes. At 18, I went to college, and Jeffy was still 5. I came back during the summers to work at my Uncle Joe's jewelry store. Jeffy hadn't changed. And now I knew there was something different about him, something wrong, something weird. Jeffy was still 5 years old, not a day older. And at 22, I came home for keeps, to open a Sony television franchise in town, the very first one. And I saw Jeffy from time to time. Jeffy was 5. Things are better in a lot of ways. People don't die from some of the old diseases anymore. Cars go faster and they get you there more quickly on better roads. Shirts are softer and silkier. We have paperback books even though they cost as much as a good hardcover used to. When I'm running short in the bank, I can live off credit cards till things even out. But I still think we've lost a lot of good stuff. Did you know you can't buy linoleum anymore, only vinyl floor covering? There's no such thing as oilcloth anymore. You'll never again smell that special, sweet smell from your grandmother's kitchen. Furniture isn't made to last 30 years or longer because they took a survey and they found that young homemakers like to throw their furniture out and bring in all new color-coded borax every 7 years. Records don't feel right. They're not thick and solid like the old ones. They're thin and you can bend them. And that doesn't seem right to me. Restaurants don't serve cream in pitchers anymore, just that artificial glop in little plastic tubs, and one is never enough to get coffee the right color. You can make a dent in a car fender with only a sneaker. And everywhere you go, all the towns look the same with Burger Kings and McDonald's and 7-Elevens and Taco Bells and motels and shopping centers. Things may be better, but why do I keep thinking about the past? What I mean by 5 years old is not that Jeffy was retarded. I don't think that's what it was. Smart as a whip for 5 years old. Very bright, quick, cute, a funny kid. But he was 3 feet tall, small for his age and perfectly formed. No big head, no strange jaw, none of that. A nice, normal-looking 5-year-old kid, except he was the same age as I was, 22. When he spoke, it was with the squeaking soprano voice of a 5-year-old. When he walked, it was with the little hops and shuffles of a 5-year-old. When he talked to you, it was about the concerns of a 5-year-old. Comic books, playing soldier, using a clothespin to attach a stiff piece of cardboard to the front fork of his bike so the sound it made when the spokes hit was like a motorboat. You know, asking questions like, why does that thing do that like that? How high is up? How old is old? Why is grass green? What's an elephant look like? At 22, he was 5. Jeffy's parents were a sad pair. Because I was still a friend of Jeffy's, still let him hang around with me in the stores, sometimes took him to the county fair or to the miniature golf or the movies, I wound up spending time with them. Not that I much cared for them because they were so awfully depressing. But then I suppose one couldn't expect much more from the poor devils. They had an alien thing in their home, a child who had grown no older than 5 in 22 years, who provided the treasure of that special childlike state indefinitely, but who also denied them the joys of watching the child grow into a normal adult. 5 is a wonderful time of life for a little kid, or it can be if the child is relatively free of the monstrous beastliness other children indulge in. It is a time when the eyes are wide open and the patterns aren't yet set, a time when one hasn't yet been hammered into accepting everything as immutable and hopeless, a time when the hands cannot do enough, the mind cannot learn enough. The world is infinite and colorful and filled with mysteries. 5 is a special time before they take the questing, unquenchable, quixotic soul of the young dreamer and thrust it into dreary schoolroom boxes. A time before they take the trembling hands that want to hold everything, touch everything, figure everything out, and make them lie still on desktops. A time before people begin saying, act your age, and grow up, or you're behaving like a baby. It's a time when a child who acts adolescent is still cute and responsive and everyone's pet. A time of delight, of wonder, of innocence. Jeffy had been stuck in that time, just 5, just so. But for his parents, it was an ongoing nightmare from which no one, not social workers, not priests, not child psychologists, not teachers, not friends, not medical wizards, not psychiatrists, no one could slap or shake them awake. For 17 years, their sorrow had grown through stages of parental dotage to concern, from concern to worry, from worry to fear, from fear to confusion, from confusion to anger, from anger to dislike, from dislike to naked hatred, and finally, from deepest loathing and revulsion to a stolid, depressive acceptance. John Kinzer was a shift foreman at the Balder Tool and Die Plant. He was a 30-year man. To everyone but the man living it, his was a spectacularly uneventful life. In no way was he remarkable, save that he had fathered a 22-year-old 5-year-old. John Kinzer was a small man, soft, with no sharp angles, with pale eyes that never seemed to hold mine for longer than a few seconds. He continually shifted in his chair during conversations, and he seemed to see things in the upper corners of the room, things no one else could see or wanted to see. I suppose the word that best suited him was haunted. What his life had become, well, haunted suited him. Leona Kinzer tried valiantly to compensate. No matter what hour of the day I visited, she always tried to foist food on me. And when Jeffy was in the house, she was always at him about eating. Honey, would you like an orange, a nice orange, or a tangerine? I have tangerines. I could peel a tangerine for you. But there was clearly such fear in her, fear of her own child, that the offers of sustenance always had a faintly ominous tone. Leona Kinzer had been a tall woman, but the years had bent her. She seemed always to be seeking some area of wallpapered wall or storage niche into which she could fade, adopt some chintz or rose-patterned protective coloration, and hide forever in plain sight of the child's big brown eyes, pass her 100 times a day and never realize she was there holding her breath, invisible. She always had an apron tied around her waist, and her hands were red from cleaning, as if by maintaining the environment immaculately she could, pay off her imagined sin, having given birth to this strange creature. Neither of them watched television very much. The house was usually dead silent, not even the sibilant whispering of water in the pipes, the creaking of timbers settling, the humming of the refrigerator. Awfully silent. As if time itself had taken a detour around that house. As for Jeffy, he was inoffensive. He lived in that atmosphere of gentle dread and dulled loathing, and if he understood it, he never remarked in any way. He played as a child plays, and seemed happy. But he must have sensed, in the way of a 5-year-old, just how alien he was in their presence. Alien. No, that wasn't right. No, he was too human, if anything. But out of phase, out of sync with the world around him, and resonating to a different vibration than his parents. God knows. Nor would other children play with him. As they grew past him, they found him at first childish, and then uninteresting, and then simply frightening as their perceptions of aging became clear, and they could see he was not affected by time as they were. Even the little ones, his own age, who might wander into the neighborhood, quickly came to shy away from him like a dog in the street when a car backfires. Thus, I remained his only friend, a friend of many years, 5 years, 22 years. I liked him. I liked him more than I can say. And I never knew exactly why, but I did, without reserve. But because we spent time together, I found I was also polite society, spending time with John and Leona Kinzer. Dinner, Saturday afternoon sometimes, an hour or so when I'd bring Jeffy back from a movie. They were grateful. They were slavishly grateful. It relieved them of the embarrassing chore of going out with him, or having to pretend before the world that they were loving parents with a perfectly normal, happy, attractive child. And their gratitude extended to hosting me. Oh, God, hideous. Every moment of their depression, hideous. I felt sorry for the poor devils, but I despised them for their inability to love Jeffy, who was eminently lovable. I never let on, of course, even during the evenings in their company that were awkward beyond belief. We would sit there in the darkening living room, always dark or darkening, with just maybe one light on, as if kept in shadow to hold back what the light might reveal to the world outside through the bright eyes of the house. And we would sit and silently stare at one another, and they never knew what to say to me. So how are things down at the plant? I'd say to John Kinzer. He would shrug. Neither conversation nor life suited him with any ease or grace. Fine, just fine, he would say finally. And we would sit in silence again. Would you like a nice piece of coffee cake? Leona would say. I made it fresh just this morning. Or deep dish green apple pie, or milk and Toll House cookies, or a brown Betty pudding. No. Thanks, Mrs. Kinzer. Jeffy and I grabbed a couple of cheeseburgers on the way home. And again, silence. Silence. Then, when the stillness and the awkwardness became too much even for them, and who knew how long that total silence reigned when they were alone, with that thing they never talked about anymore hanging between them, Leona Kinzer would say, I think he's asleep. And John Kinzer would say, I don't hear the radio playing. Just so. It would go on like that, until I could politely find excuse to bolt away on some flimsy pretext. Yeah, that was the way it would go on every time. Just the same. Except once. Once. I don't know what to do anymore, Leona said. She began crying. There's no change, not one day of peace. Her husband managed to drag himself out of the old easy chair and went to her. He bent and tried to soothe her, but it was clear from the graceless way in which he touched her graying hair that the ability to be compassionate had been stunned in him. Shh, Leona, it's all right. It's all right. Shh, shh, shh. But she continued crying. Her hands scraped gently at the antimacassars on the arms of the chair. And then she said, Sometimes I wish he had been stillborn. John looked up into the corners of the room for the nameless shadows that were always watching him. Was it God he was seeking in those spaces? You don't mean that, he said to her, softly, pathetically, urging her with body tension and trembling in his voice to recant before God took notice of the terrible thought. But she meant it. She meant it very much. I managed to get away quickly that evening. They didn't want witnesses to their shame. I was glad to go. And for a week I stayed away. From them, from Jeffy, from their street, even from that end of town. I had my own life. The store, accounts, suppliers, conferences, poker with friends, pretty women I took to well-lit restaurants, my own parents, putting antifreeze in the car, complaining to the laundry about too much starch in the collars and cuffs, working out at the gym, taxes, catching Jan or David, whichever one it was, stealing from the cash register. I had my own life, you see. But not even that evening could keep me from Jeffy. He called me at the store and asked me to take him to the rodeo. We chummed it up as best a 22-year-old with other interests could, with a 5-year-old. I never dwelled on what bound us together. I always thought it was simply the years. That and affection for a kid who could have been the little brother I never had. Except I remembered when we had played together, when we had both been the same age. I remembered that period, and Jeffy was still the same. And then, one Saturday afternoon, I came to take him to a double feature, and things I should have noticed so many times before, I first began to notice only that afternoon. I came walking up to the Kinzer house, expecting Jeffy to be sitting on the front porch steps or in the porch glider waiting for me, but he wasn't anywhere in sight. Going inside into that darkness and silence, in the midst of May sunshine, was unthinkable. So I stood on the front walk for a few moments, and then I cupped my hands around my mouth and I yelled, Jeffy! Hey, Jeffy, come on out, let's go, we're going to be late. His voice came faintly, as if from under the ground. Here I am, Donnie. I could hear him, but I couldn't see him. It was Jeffy, no question about it. As Donald H. Horton, president and sole owner of the Horton TV and Sound Center, no one but Jeffy called me Donnie. He had never called me anything else. Actually, it isn't a lie. I am, as far as the public is concerned, sole owner of the center. The partnership with my Aunt Patricia is only to repay the loan she made me to supplement the money I came into when I was 21, left to me when I was 10 by my grandfather. It wasn't a very big loan, only $18,000, but I asked her to be a silent partner because of when she had taken care of me as a child. Where are you, Jeffy?
Under the porch in my secret place.
I walked around the side of the porch and stooped down and pulled away the wicker grating. Back in there on the pressed dirt, Jeffy had built himself a secret place. He had comics in orange crates. He had a little table and some pillows. It was lit by big fat candles, and we used to hide there when we were both 5. What you up to? I asked, crawling in and pulling the grate closed behind me. It was cool under the porch, and the dirt smelled comfortable. The candles smelled clubby and familiar. Any kid would feel at home in such a secret place. There's never been a kid who didn't spend the happiest, most productive, most deliciously mysterious times of his life in such a secret place.
Played,
he said. He was holding something golden and round. It filled the palm of his little hand. You forget we were going to the movies?
Nope, I was just waiting for you here.
Your mom and dad home? Baba? I understood why he was waiting on the porch. I didn't push it any further. Yeah, what have you got there?
Captain Midnight's secret decoder badge,
he said, showing it to me on his flattened palm. I realized I was looking at it without comprehending what it was for a long time. And then it dawned on me what a miracle Jeffy had in his hand. A miracle that simply could not exist. Jeffy, I said softly with wonder in my voice, where'd you get that?
Came in the mail today. I sent away for it.
Must have cost a lot of money.
Not so much. 10 cents and 2 inner wax seals for 2 jars of Ovaltine.
May I see it? My voice was trembling, and so was the hand I extended. He gave it to me, and I held the miracle in the palm of my hand. Oh, God, it was wonderful. You remember? Captain Midnight went on the radio nationwide in 1940. It was sponsored by Ovaltine. And every year they issued a secret squadron decoder badge. And every day at the end of the program, they would give you a clue to the next day's installment in a code that only kids with the official badge could decipher. They stopped making those wonderful decoder badges in 1949. I remember the one I had in 1945. It was beautiful. It had a magnifying glass in the center of the code dial. Listen, Captain Midnight went off the air in 1950. And though I understand it was a short-lived television series in the mid-50s, and though they issued decoder badges in 1955 and 1956, as far as the real badges were concerned, they never made one after 1949. And the Captain Midnight codograph I held in my hand, the one Jeffy said he had gotten in the mail for 10 cents, 10 cents! And 2 Ovaltine labels, was brand new. Shiny gold metal, not a dent or a spot of rust on it like the old ones you can find at exorbitant prices in collectible shoppies from time to time. It was a new decoder, and the date on it was this year. But Captain Midnight no longer existed. Nothing like it existed on the radio. I'd listened to the 1 or 2 weak imitations of old-time radio the networks were currently airing, and the stories were dull, the sound effects bland, the whole feel of it wrong, out of date, cornball. Yet I held a new codograph. Jeffy, tell me about this, I said.
Tell you what, Donnie, it's my new Captain Midnight secret decoder badge. I use it to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow.
Tomorrow how?
On the program.
What program? He stared at me as if I was being purposely stupid.
On Captain Midnight. Boy!
I was being dumb. I still couldn't get it straight. It was right there, right out in the open, and I still didn't know what was happening. You mean one of those records they made of the old-time radio programs? Nostalgia? Is that what you mean, Jeffy?
What records?
He asked. He didn't know what I meant. We stared at each other there under the porch, and then I said very slowly, almost afraid of the answer, Jeffy, how do you hear Captain Midnight?
Every day. On the radio, on my radio, every day at 5:30.
News. Music. Dumb music. And news. That's what was on the radio every day at 5:30, not Captain Midnight. The secret squadron hadn't been on the air in 20 years. Can we hear it tonight? I asked. Boy, he said. I was being dumb. I knew it from the way he said it, but I didn't know why. And then it dawned on me. This was Saturday. Captain Midnight was on Monday through Friday, not on Saturday or Sunday.
We going to the movies?
He had to repeat himself twice. My mind was somewhere else. Nothing definite. No conclusions, no wild assumptions leapt to, just off somewhere trying to figure it out and concluding as you would have concluded, as anyone would have concluded, rather than accepting the truth, the impossible and wonderful truth, just finally concluding there was a simple explanation I didn't yet perceive. Something mundane and dull, like the passage of time that steals all good old things from us, pack-ratting trinkets and plastic in exchange, and all in the name of progress.
We going to the movies, Dottie?
You bet your boots we are, kiddo, I said, and I smiled, and I handed him the photograph, and he put it in his side pants pocket, and we crawled out from under the porch, and we went to the movies. And neither of us said anything about Captain Midnight all the rest of that day, and there wasn't a 10-minute stretch all the rest of that day that I didn't think about it. It was inventory all that next week. I didn't see Jeffy till late Thursday. I confess I left the store in the hands of Jan and David. Told them I had some errands to run, and I left early at 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock. I got to the Kinzers right around 4:45. Leona answered the door, looking exhausted and distant. Is Jeffy around? She said he was upstairs in his room, listening to the radio. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. All right. I had finally made that impossible, illogical leap. Had the stretch of belief involved anyone but Jeffy, adult or child, I would have reasoned out more explicable answers. But it was Jeffy, clearly another kind of vessel of life, Jeffy, and what he might experience should not be expected to fit into the ordered scheme. I admitted. I wanted to hear what I heard. Even with the door closed, I recognized the program. There he goes, Tennessee! Get him! There was the heavy report of a rifle shot and the keening whine of the slug ricocheting. Ping! And then the same voice yelled triumphantly, Got him! Dead center! He was listening to the American Broadcasting Company, 790 kilocycles, and he was hearing Tennessee Jed, one of my most favorite programs from the 40s, a Western adventure I had not heard in 20 years because it had not existed for 20 years. I sat down on the top step of the stairs there in the upstairs hall of the Kinzer home, and I listened to the show. It wasn't a rerun of an old program because there were occasional references in the body of the drama to current cultural and technological developments and phrases that had not existed in common usage in the 40s. Aerosol spray cans, laser racing of tattoos, Tanzania, the word uptight. I could not ignore the fact. Jeffy was listening to a new segment of Tennessee Jed. I ran downstairs and out the front door to my car. Leona must have been in the kitchen. I turned the key and punched on the radio and spun the dial of 790 kilocycles, the ABC station. Rock music. Rock music! I sat there for a few moments, and then I ran the dial slowly from one end to the other. Music, news, talk shows, no Tennessee Jed. And it was a Blaupunkt, the best radio I could get. I wasn't missing some perimeter station. It simply was not there. AM, FM, it wasn't there. After a few moments, I turned off the radio and the ignition and went back upstairs quietly. I sat down on the top step and listened to the entire program. God, it was wonderful. Exciting, imaginative, filled with everything I remembered as being most innovative about radio drama, but it was modern. It wasn't an antique rebroadcast to assuage the need of that dwindling listenership who longed for the old days. It was a new show with all the old voices, but still young and bright. Even the commercials were for currently available products, but they weren't as loud or as insulting as the screamer ads one heard on radio these days. And when Tennessee Jed went off at 5 o'clock, I heard Jeffy spin the dial on his radio till I heard the familiar voice of the announcer Glenn Riggs proclaim, Presenting Hop Harrigan, America's ace of the airwaves. There was the sound of an airplane in flight. It was a prop plane, not a jet, not the sound kids today have grown up with, but the sound I grew up with, the real sound of an airplane, the growling, revving, throaty kind of the sound, the kind of airplanes G8 and his battle aces flew, the kind Captain Midnight flew, the kind Hop Harrigan flew. And then I heard Hop say, CX-4 calling control tower, CX-4 calling control tower, standing by. A pause, then, okay, this is Hop Harrigan, coming in. And Jeffy, who had the same problem all of us kids had had in the 40s with programming that pitted equal favorites against one another on different stations, having paid his respects to Hop Harrigan and Tank Tinker, spun the dial and went back to ABC, where I heard the stroke of a gong, bong, the wild cacophony of nonsense Chinese chatter, and the announcer yelled, Terry and the Pirates! I sat there on the top step and listened to Terry and Connie and Flip Corkin and so help me God, Agnes Moorehead as the Dragon Lady. All of them in a new adventure that took place in a red China that had not existed in the days of Milton Caniff's 1937 version of the Orient, with river pirates and Chiang Kai-shek and warlords and the naive imperialism of American gunboat diplomacy. Sat and listened to the whole show, and sat even longer to hear Superman, and part of Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, and part of Captain Midnight. And John Kinzer came home, and neither he nor Leona came upstairs to find out what had happened to me or where Jeffy was, and sat longer and found I had started crying and could not stop. Just sat there with tears running down my face into the corners of my mouth, sitting and crying until Jeffy heard me and opened his door and saw me and came out and looked at me in childish confusion as I heard the station break for the Mutual Network, and they began the theme music of Tom Mix. When it's roundup time in Texas and the bloom is on the sage. And Jeffy touched my shoulder, and he smiled at me with his mouth and his big brown eyes, and he said, Hi, Dottie. Want to come in and listen to the radio with me? Hume denied the existence of an absolute space in which each thing has its place. Borges denies the existence of one single time in which all events are linked. Jeffy received radio programs from a place that could not, in logic, in the natural scheme of the space-time universe as conceived by Einstein, exist. But that wasn't all he received. He got mail-order premiums that no one was manufacturing. He read comic books that had been defunct for 3 decades. He saw movies with actors who had been dead for 20 years. He was the receiving terminal for endless joys and pleasures of the past that the world had dropped along the way. On its headlong, suicidal flight toward brave new tomorrows, the world had raised its treasure house of simple happinesses, had poured concrete over its playgrounds, had abandoned its elfin stragglers, and all of it was being impossibly, miraculously shunted back into the present through Jeffy. Through Jeffy. Revivified, updated, the traditions maintained but contemporaneous, Jeffy. Jeffy was the unbidding Aladdin whose very nature formed the magic lampness of his reality. And he took me into his world with him because he trusted me. We had breakfast of Quaker puffed wheat Sparkies and warm Ovaltine we drank out of this year's Little Orphan Annie shake-up mugs. We went to the movies, and while everyone else was seeing a comedy starring Goldie Hawn and Ryan O'Neal, Jeffy and I were enjoying Humphrey Bogart as the professional thief Parker in John Huston's brilliant adaptation of the Donald Westlake novel Slayground. The second feature was Spencer Tracy, Carol Lombard, and Laird Cregar in the Val Lewton-produced film of Lineagen versus the Ants. Twice a month, we went down to the newsstand and bought the current pulp issues of The Shadow, Doc Savage, and Startling Stories. Jeffy and I sat together, and I read to him for the magazines. He particularly liked the new short novel by Henry Kuttner, The Dreams of Achilles, and the new Stanley G. Weinbaum series of short stories set in the subatomic particle universe of Radurna. In September, we enjoyed the first installment of the new Robert E. Howard Conan novel, Isle of the Black Ones, in Weird Tales. And in August, we were only mildly disappointed by Edgar Rice Burroughs' fourth novella in the Jupiter series featuring John Carter of Barsoom, Corsairs of Jupiter. But the editor of Argosy All-Story Weekly promised there would be 2 more stories in the series, and it was such an unexpected revelation for Jeffy and me that it dimmed our disappointment at the lesson quality of the current story. We read comics together, and Jeffy and I both decided separately, before we came together to discuss it, that our favorite characters were Doll Man, Airboy, and the Heap. We also adored the George Carlson strips and Jingle Jangle comics, particularly the pie-faced prince of old Pretzelberg stories, which we read together and laughed over, even though I had to explain some of the esoteric puns to Jeffy, who was too young to have that kind of subtle wit. How to explain it? I can't. I had enough physics in college to make some offhand guesses, but I'm more likely wrong than right. The laws of the conservation of energy occasionally break. These are laws that physicists call weakly violated. Perhaps Jeffy was a catalyst for the weak violation of conservation laws we're only now beginning to realize exist. I tried doing some reading in the area, muon decay of the forbidden kind, gamma decay that doesn't include the muon neutrino among its products, but nothing I encountered, not even the latest readings from the Swiss Institute for Nuclear Research near Zurich, gave me an insight. I was thrown back on a vague acceptance of the philosophy that the real name for science is magic. No explanations. But enormous good times. The happiest time of my life. I had the real world. The world of my store and my friends and my family, the world of profit and loss, of taxes and evenings with young women who talked about going shopping or the United Nations or the rising cost of coffee and microwave ovens. And I had Jeffy's world, in which I existed only when I was with him. The things of the past he knew as fresh and new, I could experience only when in his company. And the membrane between the two worlds grew ever thinner, more luminous and transparent. I had the best of both worlds, and knew, somehow, that I could carry nothing from one to the other. And forgetting that for just a moment, betraying Jeffy by forgetting, brought an end to it all. Enjoying myself so much, I grew careless. I failed to consider how fragile the relationship between Jeffy's world and my world really was. There is a reason why the present begrudges the existence of the past. I never really understood. Nowhere in the Beast books, where survival is shown in battles between claw and fang, tentacle and poison sac, is there recognition of the ferocity the present always brings to bear on the past. Nowhere is there a detailed statement of how the present lies in wait for what was, waiting for it to become now this moment so it can shred it with its merciless jaws. Who could know such a thing at any age? And certainly not at my age. Who could understand such a thing? I'm trying to exculpate myself. I can't. It was my fault. It was another Saturday afternoon. "What's playing today?" I asked him in the car on the way downtown. He looked up at me from the other side of the front seat and smiled one of his best smiles.
"Ken Maynard in Bullwhip Justice and the Demolished Man."
He kept smiling as if he'd really put one over on me. I looked at him with disbelief. "You're kidding." "You're kidding," I said, delighted. "Bester's the Demolished Man?" He nodded his head, delighted at my being delighted. He knew it was one of my favorite books. "Oh, that's super."
"Super duper," he said.
"Who's in it?"
"Franchot Tone, Evelyn Keyes, Lionel Barrymore, and Elisha Cook Jr."
He was much more knowledgeable about movie actors than I'd ever been. He could name the character actors in any movie he'd ever seen, even the crowd scenes. "And cartoons?" I asked.
Three of them, yeah. There's a Little Lulu, a Donald Duck, and a Bugs Bunny, and a Pete Smith specialty, and a Lulaire Monkeys is the craziest peoples.
"Oh, boy," I said. I was grinning from ear to ear, and then I looked down and saw the pad of purchase order forms on the seat. I'd forgotten to drop it off at the store. I got to stop by the center," I said. Got to drop off something. It'll only take a minute."
"Okay," Jeffy said, "but we won't be late, will we?"
"Not on your tintype, kiddo," I said. When I pulled into the parking lot behind the center, he decided to come in with me and we'd walk over to the theater. It's not a large town. There were only two movie houses, the Utopia and the Lyric. We were going to the Utopia, and it was only 3 blocks from the center. I walked into the store with the pad of forms, and it was bedlam. David and Jan were handling 2 customers each, and there were people standing around waiting to be helped. Jan turned to look on me, and her face was a horror mask of pleading. David was running from the stockroom to the showroom, and all he could murmur as he whipped past was, "Help!" And then he was gone. "Jeffy," I said, crouching down, "listen, give me a few minutes. Jan and David are in trouble with all these people. We won't be late, I promise. Just let me get rid of a couple of these customers, okay?" He looked nervous, but he nodded okay. I motioned to a chair, and I said, "Just sit down for a while, and I'll be right with you." He went to the chair, good as you please, though he knew what was happening, and he sat down. I started taking care of people who wanted color television sets. This was the first really substantial batch of units we'd gotten in. Color television was only now becoming reasonably priced, and this was Sony's first promotion, and it was bonanza time for me. I could see paying off the loan and being out in front for the first time with the center. It was business. You understand? It was business. And in my world, good business comes first. Jeffy sat there and he stared at the wall. Let me tell you about the wall. Stanchion and bracket designs had been rigged from floor to within 2 feet of the ceiling. Television sets had been stacked artfully on the wall. 33 television sets, all playing at the same time. Black and white, color, little ones, big ones, all going at the same time. Jeffy sat and watched 33 television sets on a Saturday afternoon. We can pick up a total of 13 channels, including the UHF educational stations. Golf was on one channel. Baseball was on a second. Celebrity bowling was on a third. The fourth channel was a religious seminar. A teenage dance show was on the fifth. The sixth was a rerun of a situation comedy. The seventh was a rerun of a police show. Eighth was a nature program showing a man fly casting endlessly. Ninth was news and conversation. 10th was a stock car race. 11th was a man doing logarithms on a blackboard. 12th was a woman in a leotard doing setting up exercises. And on the 13th channel was a badly animated cartoon show in Spanish. All but 6 of the shows were repeated on 3 sets. Jeffy sat and watched that wall of television on a Saturday afternoon while I sold as fast and as hard as I could to pay back my Aunt Patricia and stay in touch with my world, because it was business. Understand? I should have known that. I should have understood about the present and the way it kills the past, the way it lies in wait. But I was selling with both hands, and when I finally glanced over at Jeffy half an hour later, he looked like another child. He was sweating, that terrible fever sweat when you have stomach flu. He was pale, as pasty and pale as a worm, and his little hands were gripping the arms of the chair so tightly I could see his knuckles in bold relief. I dashed over to him, excusing myself from the middle-aged couple looking at the new 21-inch Mediterranean model. Jeffy! He looked at me, but his eyes didn't track. He was in absolute terror. I pulled him out of the chair and started toward the front door with him, but the customers I deserted yelled at me. "Hey!" the middle-aged man said. "You want to sell me this thing or don't you?" I looked from him to Jeffy and back again. Jeffy was like a zombie. He had come where I'd pulled him. His legs were rubbery and his feet dragged. The past being eaten by the present, the sound of something in pain. I clawed some money out of my pants pocket and I jammed it into Jeffy's hand. Kiddo, listen to me, get out of here right now. He still couldn't focus properly. Jeffy, I said as tightly as I could, listen to me. The middle-aged customer and his wife were walking toward us. Listen, kiddo, get out of here right this minute. Walk over to the Utopia and buy the tickets. I'll be right behind you. The middle-aged man and his wife were almost on us. I shoved Jeffy through the door and watched him stumble away in the wrong direction and then stop as if gathering his wits, turn and go back past the front of the center and in the direction of the Utopia. "Yes, sir," I said, straightening up and facing him. "Yes, ma'am, that's one terrific set with some sensational feature. Now, if you're just going to step back here with me for a moment." There was a terrible sound of something hurting, but I couldn't tell from which channel or from which set it was coming. Most of it I learned later, from the girl in the ticket booth, and from some people I knew who came to me to tell me what had happened. By the time I got to the Utopia, nearly 20 minutes later, Jeffy was already beaten to a pulp and had been taken to the manager's office. Did you see a very little boy about 5 years old with big brown eyes and straight brown hair? He was waiting for me? "Oh, I think that's the little boy those kids beat up." "What? What? Where is he?" "They took him to the manager's office. No one knew who he was or where to find his parents." A young girl wearing an usher's uniform was kneeling down beside the couch, placing a wet paper towel on his face. I took the towel away from her and ordered her out of the office. She looked insulted and snorted something rude, but she left. I sat on the edge of the couch and tried to swab away the blood from the lacerations without opening the wounds where the blood had caked. Both his eyes were swollen shut. His mouth was ripped badly. His hair was matted with dried blood. He had been standing in line behind 2 kids in their teens. They started selling tickets at 12:30 and the show started at 1 o'clock. The doors weren't open until 12:45. He had been waiting, and the kids in front of him had had a portable radio. They were listening to the ball game. Jeffy had wanted to hear some program. God knows what it might have been. Grand Central Station, Let's Pretend, Land of the Lost. God only knows which one it might have been. He had asked if he could borrow their radio to hear the program for a minute, and it had been a commercial break or something, and the kids had given him the radio, probably out of some malicious kind of courtesy that would permit them to take offense and rag the little boy. He had changed the station, and they'd been unable to get it to go back to the ball game. It was locked into the past, on a station that was broadcasting a program that didn't exist for anyone but Jeffy. And they had beaten him badly, as everyone watched. And then they had run away. I had left him alone, left him to fight off the present. Without sufficient weaponry, I had betrayed him for the sale of a 21-inch Mediterranean console television, and now his face was pulped meat. He moaned something inaudible and sobbed softly. Shh, shh, shh. It's okay, kiddo. It's Donnie. I'm here. I'll get you home. It'll be okay. Shh, shh. I should have taken him straight to the hospital. I don't know why I didn't. I should have. I should have done that. When I carried him through the door, John and Leona Kinzer just stared at me. They didn't move to take him from my arms. One of his hands was hanging down. He was conscious, but just barely. They stared, there in the semi-darkness of a late Saturday afternoon in the present. I looked at them. A couple of kids beat him up at the theater. I raised him a few inches in my arms and extended him. They stared at me, at both of us, with nothing in their eyes, without movement. Jesus Christ! I shouted. He's been beaten. He's your son. Don't you even want to touch him? What the hell kind of people are you? Then Leona moved toward me very slowly. She stood in front of us for a few seconds, and there was a leaden stoicism in her face that was terrible to see. It said, I have been in this place before, many times, and I cannot bear to be in it again, but I am here now. So I gave him to her. God help me, I gave him over to her. And she took him upstairs to bathe away his blood and his pain. And John Kinzer and I stood in our separate places in the dim living room of their home, and we stared at each other. He had nothing to say to me. I shoved past him and fell into a chair. I was shaking. I heard the bathwater running upstairs. After what seemed a very long time, Leona came downstairs, wiping her hands on her apron. And she sat down on the sofa, and after a moment, John sat down beside her. Sat there beside her. I heard the sound of rock music from upstairs. Would you like a piece of nice pound cake? Leona said. I didn't answer. I was listening to the sound of the music. Rock music. On the radio. There was a table lamp on the end table beside the sofa. It cast a dim and futile light in the shadowed living room. Rock music from the present on a radio upstairs. I started to say something and then knew. Oh, God, no! I jumped up just as the sound of hideous crackling blotted out the music, and the table lamp dimmed and flickered. I screamed something, I don't know what it was, and I ran for the stairs. Jeffy's parents did not move. They sat there, beside each other, silent, with their hands folded, in that place they had been in for so many years. I fell twice rushing up the stairs. There isn't much on television that can hold my interest. I bought an old cathedral-shaped Philco radio in a second-hand store, and I replaced all the burnt-out parts with the original tubes from old radios I could cannibalize that still worked. I don't use transistors or printed circuits. They wouldn't work. I've sat in front of that set for hours sometimes, running the dial back and forth as slowly as you can imagine. So slowly it doesn't look as if it's moving at all sometimes. But I can't find Captain Midnight, or the Land of the Lost, or The Shadow, or Quiet Please. So she did love him still a little bit, even after all those years. I can't hate them. They only wanted to live in the present world again. And that isn't such a terrible thing. It's a good world, all things considered. It's much better than it used to be in a lot of ways. People don't die from the old diseases anymore. They die from new ones, but that's progress, isn't it? Isn't it? Tell me. Somebody please tell me.
All right. We are going to start our 10-minute potty break between stories here, and then we will be back in 10 minutes with The Neighbor by Dean Koontz. All right, we are back. We are so back, my friends. This next story is called The Neighbor, and it's written by Dean Koontz. This is a pretty straightforward horror story. I haven't read a ton of Dean Koontz in my life, but from what I have read, I find his style to be very on the nose. And by that I mean I think he writes in a very sort of ham-fisted way, which tends to lack nuance, but it's very easy to understand and follow along with as a result, so I think that's pretty great. The sentiments he expresses in his work are impossible to miss or stumble over, because he's always putting a big neon sign over them which says, "Here's the point." And it leaves very little ambiguity, very little room for interpretation, but it's still good fun entertainment, which is very well executed for what it is. So let's listen to The Neighbor by Dean Koontz.
1. My name is Malcolm Pomerantz, and I'm an axeman, though not like those guys on that reality TV show about loggers. Had I ever been that kind of axeman, I would long ago have cut off both feet or been crushed by a toppling tree. I've been clumsy all my life. I have managed not to stumble into an accidental death only because my profession, I'm a musician, doesn't require me to deal with power tools or treacherous terrain. Axe is musician slang for instrument, and my axe is a saxophone. I have been playing it since I was 7, when the sax and I were nearly the same size. I'm 59 now, 2 years older than Jonah, my best friend of half a century. I'm tall and Jonah's not. I'm white, he's black. When I first met him in the summer of 1967, Jonah was 10 and quick and graceful, a piano prodigy, and I was 12 and lumbered around like Lurch, the butler in the Addams Family, which had been big on TV the previous year. When I first heard him playing, he rocked the keyboard with Fats Domino's "I'm Gonna Be a Wheel Someday." In both our lives, 1967 proved to be unforgettable. At my insistence, Jonah recently talked his life, or at least a strange and tumultuous portion of it, into a tape recorder, and his story became a book titled The City. There isn't any point in talking my life because most of the interesting parts are what happened when I was hanging out with Jonah. He's already covered that territory. I do have one little experience to recount, however, a curious series of events that occurred a few weeks before I met him. Like his more engaging story, mine suggests that the world is a more mysterious place than it seems to be most of the time, when we are plodding along from breakfast to bedtime in a reassuringly familiar routine. In those days, my sister Amalia was 17, 5 years older than I was, but we were as close as twins. Not that we looked alike. Blonde hair and a ponytail, she was lithe and graceful, full of such enthusiasm for life that both in sunshine and in shadow, she had a glow that I swear was not entirely a figment of her adoring little brother's imagination. On the other hand, I was a loose-limbed 12-year-old with an Adam's apple that made me look as if I had swallowed a Granny Smith whole and had gotten it stuck in my throat. Although she didn't have much of a wardrobe, Amalia always wore the right thing for the occasion and looked as if she'd stepped out of a Sears catalog. With my round shoulders and arms as disproportionately long as those of an orangutan, I tried to disguise my awkward form by dressing as if I were an adult, though, being blind to fashion, I only called greater attention to my gangly nature. Black wingtips, but with white socks. Dress pants hiked a couple of inches north of my navel. My short-sleeved, spread-collar white shirt buttoned all the way to the throat. At 12, I didn't yet think much about girls. Considering my long, pale face and hound-dog eyes behind black-rimmed glasses with thick lenses, maybe I already knew that even through adulthood I'd never be a guy who had flocks of pretty girls in flight around him. I had the love of my sister and my saxophone, and that was enough. It had better be enough, because Amalia and I didn't have a home life that would be suitable for a TV show like Ozzie and Harriet or Leave It to Beaver. Our old man was a machinist, a foreman for an entire shop of lathe operators, most of the time as silent as a rock, a cold man, who by his stare alone could convey his disapproval and his ardent wish that he could hold you to his lathe and shape you into someone more appealing. Chesterfield cigarettes were to him what the Eucharist is to devout Catholics. Amalia insisted he wasn't cold, but only wounded by life and emotionally isolated. Our mother liked TV around the clock, interludes of neighborhood gossip with Mrs. Janowski, who lived next door, and Lucky Strike cigarettes, which she burned through as if the fate of the earth depended on her chain-smoking even through meals, which she usually took on a TV tray in the living room. She prided herself on being a fine housekeeper, by which she meant that she efficiently delegated all the work to Amalia and me. The king and queen of our little lower-middle-class castle spoke to each other so seldom, you might well have assumed they primarily communicated telepathically. If that were the case, then judging by their demeanor, they detested virtually every exchange of their psychic conversations. Amalia said that something profound must have happened between our parents long ago, that they had heard each other, that they'd said all they had to say about it, and that they couldn't bring themselves to forgive each other, and that, therefore, they found it painful to talk to each other about anything. Amalia didn't like to think the worst about anyone until they had proved themselves irredeemably vile. My sister had played the clarinet since she was 8, when a kid in the next block, having been forced into lessons by his folks, finally rebelled and convincingly threatened to hang himself. She'd been given the instrument for nothing, and she had wanted to learn to play it largely because she knew that it would annoy our parents. She hoped that her playing would get on their nerves so much that they would insist that she practice in the detached one-car garage, where she wouldn't have to see them so determinedly not talking to each other, where the air smelled of grease and tire rubber and mildew instead of Chesterfields and Lucky Strikes. Her hope was fulfilled, and the remaining years that we lived in the house, the words most often spoken by our mother and father were, "Take it to the garage," not only when we practiced the clarinet and saxophone, but also when our mere presence became a distraction from their TV shows, their drinking, and their committed smoking. Amalia became pretty darn good on the clarinet, but I proved to be a prodigy on the saxophone, self-taught and self-polishing, always working to get a little better. Playing the sax was the one thing I could do that was graceful. With a 4.0 grade point average and considerable writing talent, Amalia was an amateur musician with bigger things than a dance band in her future. Although our distracted mother and father didn't consider it much of an achievement, Amalia received a full scholarship to a major university based on her grades, but also based on several cool short stories that she'd written and with which she'd won prizes in various competitions. I was proud of her, and I wanted her to succeed big time, and I wanted her to escape the cancer clouds and the gloom and our parents' bitterness that made the Pomerantz place so like Poe's House of Usher just before it sank into the swamp. At the same time, I couldn't imagine what my life would be like when, at the end of that summer, she went far away to school, leaving me as the only member of the family who didn't want to eat dinner off a TV tray. In early June, nearly a month before I heard Jonah Kirk rocking that Fats Domino tune at his grandfather's house, across the street from our place, a weird thing happened next door. The residence in question was not to the east, not the Janofsky place, where my mother and Mrs. Janofsky regularly shared gossip, most of it delusional fantasy, about the marital relations of other people who lived on our block. It was instead one door west of us, at the former Rupert Clockenwall place, which had been unoccupied ever since old Mr. Clockenwall died of a massive heart attack a month earlier. The strangeness started at 3 o'clock one morning, when an unusual sound awakened me. As I sat up in bed, I didn't think the noise had been in my room. I was pretty sure it came from beyond the window, although it might have been the last sound in a dream that, by its very threatening nature, compelled the sleeper to wake. In this case, it called to mind a long sword being drawn from a metal scabbard, the stropping of steel on steel. Even in an older residential neighborhood like ours, far from the high-rises and the midtown bustle, the city is never silent, and long before you're 12 years old, you learn to tune out its most familiar rattles, clashes, and percussions to get a good night's rest. What woke me now was alien to the ear. I threw back the top sheet and got out of bed. Earlier I had raised the lower sash of the window in hope of a draft, but the night air remained warm and still. As I bent to the window, the sound came again, and seemed to vibrate in the screen, as if the blade of a stiletto had been whisked across that metal mesh, so that I startled backward. When the stropping came a third time, softer than before, I realized that it originated not inches from my face, but from the house next door, and I leaned close to the window screen once more. Between the houses stood an ancient sycamore in full leaf. Perhaps because in its early years it had received too little sunlight or had suffered a bout with disease, the tree had attained a tormented architecture and did not entirely screen my view of the Clockenwall place. Through the twisted branches, I saw lamplight bloom beyond a downstairs window. The late Rupert Clockenwall's only surviving relative was a brother who lived half a continent away. Until the small estate was settled, the house could not be put on the market for sale, and there had been no activity at the place since the day that Mr. Clockenwall died. Naturally, having the usual fantasy life of a 12-year-old, I sometimes imagined dramas where none existed, and now I wondered if a burglar might have forced entry. Lamplight brightened another window on the ground floor, and soon thereafter also one on the second floor. Through the shears that hung over that upstairs window, a sinuous, dark form whidded past the curtained glass. Although any moving shadow is bent by light and by every surface over which it travels, this one seemed particularly strange, bringing to mind the supple wings of a manta ray swimming the sea with all the grace of a bird in flight. Overcome by a sense that someone sinister must be prowling the Clockenwall house, I waited at the open window for a while, breathing the warm night air, hoping to glimpse that lithe and eerie shadow again, or something more. Eventually, when I was not rewarded by any phantasmic shape or further peculiar sounds, even my boyish desire for mystery and adventure couldn't sustain my attention. I had to admit that neither a burglar nor a vandal was likely to announce his invasion of the property by switching on nearly every light. After returning to bed, I soon fell back to sleep. I know that I had a bad dream, in which my circumstances were desperate, but when I suddenly sat up in bed at 4 a.m., I could recall nothing of that nightmare. Little more than half awake, I went to the window, not to observe the house next door, where lights still glowed, but to close the lower sash. I also locked it, though the night was hot, and a draught was much needed. I don't remember why I believed that I should engage the lock, only that I felt the urgent need to do so. In bed once more, I half slept through the last sweltering hour of the summer night, muttering like a victim of malaria in a fever dream. 2. Most mornings our old man preferred a sandwich for breakfast, usually bacon and eggs on heavily buttered toast. In bad weather, he stood at the sink to eat, staring out at the small backyard, silent and remote, as though he must be pondering important philosophical issues, or planning a murder. On the nearby cutting board stood a mug of coffee. He held the sandwich in his right hand, a cigarette in his left, alternating between the two. When witness to this, I always hoped that in error he would take a bite of the cigarette or attempt to smoke the sandwich, but he never became confused. The morning following the activity at the Clockenwall house, he ate instead on the back porch. When he descended the steps and went to work, I retrieved the empty coffee mug and ashtray that were balanced on the flat cap of the porch railing. While I washed them at the kitchen sink, Amalia served breakfast to our mother in the living room, where on the TV some movie star was being interviewed by a morning show host, the two of them competing to see who had the phoniest laugh. Our mother had ordered fried potatoes, a cheese omelet, and a cup of canned fruit cocktail. She and the old man rarely ate at the same time, and never wanted the same thing. When Amalia returned to the kitchen, she said, "I think someone moved in next door during the night. My window was open, and a voice woke me, and then there were lights in all the rooms over there." Her bedroom was on the same side of our house as mine. I said, "I didn't hear anybody. Saw the lights, someone moving around over there, just a shadow. But no realtor has put up a sign yet. Maybe they decided to rent the place instead of selling. Moving in at 3 in the morning is kind of weird. Was it just one person or a family or what? I didn't see anybody." "What about the voice?" "Oh, that must have been a dream. There wasn't anyone standing under my window. I thought someone called out from under my window, a man. but I must have been dreaming and woke up, because when I got out of bed and went to the window, no one was down there. I put placemats and flatware on the dinette table. While I made toast, burning the first 2 slices, Amalia scrambled eggs and fried slices of ham for our breakfast. "What did he say, the man under your window?" I asked. "He called my name. Twice. But I'm sure he was in the dream, not really there." "What was the dream about?" "I don't remember. Not even a scrap of it?" "Not even." Her eggs, ham, and toast were on the same plate. For me, she served those 3 items on 3 small plates, as I preferred. I had trimmed the crusts off my toasts so that I could eat them separately. Even in those days, I had little rituals with which I meant to impose a degree of order on what seemed to me to be a most disordered world. We had hardly begun to eat when the washing machine in the adjacent laundry alcove buzzed, at the end of its spin cycle. As I rose, intending to transfer the laundry to the dryer, Amalia said, "It can wait, Malcolm." Although I remained at the table, I said, "Before you go away to the university, you'll have to teach me to iron." Her green eyes sparkled. I swear they did, when something moved or amused her. "Sweetie, I'd no sooner put an iron in your hands than I would a chainsaw." "Well, he's never going to iron, and she'd do it only if she could sit down and watch game shows at the same time." "She ironed when I was too little to do it. She hasn't forgotten how." "But she won't. You know she won't. I'll be a wrinkled mess." Although I was only 12, how my clothes looked was important to me, because I myself looked like such a nerd. "Malcolm, don't you dare try to iron when I'm away at school." "I don't know. We'll see." She ate in silence for a while, and then she said, "It's not right what I'm doing, going to school so far away." "Huh? Don't be nuts. That's where you got the scholarship." "I could get one somewhere close. Stay at home instead of in a dormitory. The university has that special writing program. That's the whole point of going there. You're going to be a great writer." "I'm not going to be a great anything if I leave you here alone with them and spend the rest of my life regretting it." She was the best sister ever, funny and smart and pretty, and she was going to be famous one day. I'd whined at her about teaching me how to iron. I felt selfish, because the truth was that I wanted her to go to the university, which was going to be so good for her, but at the same time, I wanted her to stay. "I'm not all thumbs, you know. If I can play the saxophone as well as I do, I can iron clothes without burning down the house." "Anyway," she said, "nobody learns to be a novelist from a writing program. It's a very personal struggle. If you don't take that scholarship, I'll blow my brains out." "Don't be ridiculous, sweetie." "I will. Why wouldn't I? How am I supposed to live with having ruined your life?" "You could never ruin my life, Malcolm." "Well, you're the most important and wonderful thing in it." She never lied. She didn't manipulate people. If she'd been anyone but who she was, I could have looked her in the eye and insisted that I'd commit harakiri, even though I knew that I never would. Instead, I stared at the trimmed-off crusts of my toast and tore them into little pieces as I said, "You've got to take the scholarship. You've just got to. It's the best thing ever happened to us." I heard her put down her fork. After a silence, she said, "I love you too, Malcolm." And then for another reason entirely, I couldn't meet her eyes or speak. After we cleared the table, after she washed the dishes and I dried them, she said, "Hey, let's make oatmeal cookies." "With chocolate chips and walnuts?" "For Mom and Dad, we'll make them with chopped anchovies and lima beans, just to see their expressions when they bite into one. The rest with chocolate chips and walnuts. We'll take a plate of them to the new neighbors and introduce ourselves." She rattled off a list of things she needed: baking sheets, mixing bowls, a spatula, a pair of tablespoons, a measuring cup. Because I suspected that this might be the first of many tests to determine if I could eventually be entrusted with a steam iron, I remembered every item, collected them in a timely manner, and didn't drop even one. The delicious aroma of baking cookies eventually reached the living room, where our mother left the TV long enough to come to the kitchen and say, "Are you making a mess?" "No, ma'am," Amalia said. "It looks like a mess to me. Only while we're baking. It'll all be cleaned up after. There's housework that should come before this kind of thing," our mother said. "I'm ahead of schedule on the housework," Amalia assured her, "now that school is out." Mother stood just inside the door to the hall, an apparition in her quilted pink housecoat and mourning hair, looking mildly confused, as though the task upon which we were engaged must be as mystifying to her as any complex voodoo ritual. Then she said, "I like mine with almonds, not walnuts." "Sure," Amalia said. "We're going to make a batch like that." "Your father likes the walnuts, but not the chocolate chips." "We're going to make a batch like that, too," Amalia promised. To me, my mother said, "Have you dropped or broken anything?" "No, ma'am. I've got it together." "I like that glass measuring cup. They don't make them like that anymore." "I'll be careful," I said. "Be careful with it," she said, as if I'd said nothing, and she went back to the TV in the living room. Amalia and I baked the cookies. We cleaned up. I didn't break anything. And then we went next door to meet the new neighbors. 3. When we climbed the steps and set foot on the porch, we saw that the front door stood ajar. The sun remained slightly to the east, hot lights slanting under the eaves and painting a bright rhomboid on the floor. We stood on that illumined patch of gray-painted boards, as if on a trapdoor, while Amalia held the plate of cookies and I pressed the bell push. No one responded to the chimes, and I rang again. After I'd rung the bell a third time, when it seemed obvious that no one was home, Amalia said, "So maybe it was a burglar last night, in spite of all the lights. I mean, a burglar wouldn't care about leaving the door open after himself." Through the 4-inch gap between door and jamb, I could see the shallow, shadowy foyer and the darker living room beyond. Then why would a burglar bother to turn off the lights? Maybe something's wrong, someone needs help. We can't just barge in, Malcolm. Then what are we going to do? Leaning close to the door, she called out, "Hello? Anyone home?" The answering silence was worthy of our father when he stood on our back porch eating his breakfast sandwich. Amalia called out again, and when no one responded, she pushed the door inward so that we had a better view of the cramped foyer and the living room, where everything appeared to be furnished as it had been when Mr. Clockenwall had been alive. In the month since his passing, no one had come to dispose of his belongings. After my sister called out again, louder than before, I said, "Maybe we should go home and call the police and report a burglary. But if there hasn't been a burglary, can you imagine the hell they'll put us through for making that call?" By they, she didn't mean the police. Our mother liked nothing more than having a legitimate reason to criticize us. She'd peck and peck and peck at you for the littlest mistake until you thought she was going to keep at it until you were nothing but bones. And our old man, who couldn't stand the sound of our mother's voice when she was in attack mode, would shout at Amalia and me as if we were the ones making all the noise. "I'm just trying to watch a little TV here and forget what a shitty day I had at work, okay? Is that okay with you two? Is it?" Repeating her admonition to me, I said, "We can't barge in." "No, we can't," she agreed, as she stepped across the threshold with a plate of cookies. "But remember how Mr. Clockenwall wasn't found for a whole day after he died? Someone might need help." I followed her, of course. I would have followed my saintly sister through the gates of hell. By comparison, the house next door wasn't particularly forbidding. Although the shears hanging over the windows allowed a little daylight to enter, the living room remained cloaked in shadows, a silent, solemn chamber in which you might have expected to find a cadaver casketed for viewing. Amalia flipped a wall switch that turned on a lamp beside an armchair. A film of dust sheathed the table on which the lamp stood. A pair of reading glasses lay beside a paperback, that Mr. Clockenwall might have meant to read before his day turned as bad as any day could be. There were no signs of vandalism. "We live next door," Amalia called out. "We came to say hello." She waited, listening. Then, "Hello? Is everything all right?" In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. Breakfast dishes were on the table, a smear of egg yolk having turned hard and dark on the plate. Toast crumbs littered the formica surface. The heart attack had felled Mr. Clockenwall here, perhaps as he'd risen from his meal, and no one had cleaned up after the coroner's van took the body away. "It's terrible to live alone," Amalia said. The sadness in her voice seemed genuine, though Clockenwall had not been a man who reached out to his neighbors, or sought in any way to alleviate his loneliness, if in fact he was lonely. He had been polite, and if he happened to be in his yard when you were in yours, he would spend a few minutes in agreeable conversation over the fence. No one considered him aloof or cold, only shy, and on occasion melancholy. Some felt that perhaps in his past lay a tragedy with which he had never been able to make his peace, that the only companion with which he felt comfortable was sorrow. Amalia was somewhat distressed. Somebody should have cleaned up these dishes and emptied the refrigerator before things in it spoiled. Leaving it like this? It's just wrong. I shrugged. Maybe no one cared about him. My sister seemed to care about everyone, even making excuses for our parents at their worst. But now she said nothing. I sighed. "Tell me you don't mean we should clean this up?" As she was about to answer, her attitude abruptly changed. She turned with a start and said, "Who? What?" Perplexed, I said, "What? Who what?" She frowned. "You didn't hear that?" "No. What didn't I hear?" "He said, Melinda. Sweet Melinda." "Who said?" "It sounded like Mr. Clockenwall." When I was younger, and my sister was not yet perfect, she had enjoyed spooking me by reporting with great conviction things like, "Dad didn't realize I was there, and he took off his face, and under it was this lizard face." Or on one occasion, "Oh my God, I saw Mom eating live spiders." She was so convincing that I needed about a year to become immune to her bizarre declarations, and for another year I pretended to believe them because it was such fun. Then she became interested in boys and lost interest in scaring me, although I was never so scared by any of her hoaxes as by a couple of the idiot guys she dated. Even in those days, however, she was too smart to go out with a psychopathic maniac more than twice. "Mr. Clockenwall is dead and buried," I reminded her. "I know he's dead and buried." Holding the plate of cookies with her left hand, she rubbed the back of her neck with the right, as if smoothing away goose-flesh. "Or at least, he's dead." "I'm not 9 anymore, sis." "What's that mean?" "I know Mom eats only dead spiders." "I'm not joking with you, Malcolm." As before, she startled and turned, as if toward a voice that I couldn't hear. "What now?" "He said it again. Sweet Melinda." Suddenly she set out, as if in search of the speaker, turning on lights as we entered each new space, and I followed her through the rest of the ground floor, turning off the lights in our wake. When we arrived at the front of the house once more, Amalia peered up the stairs toward the gloomy realm on the higher floor. After she stood transfixed for a long moment, her face clenched with revulsion, and I asked what was happening now, and she said, "He's disgusting, obscene, sick." Suspicious but half-believing, I said, "What?" "I won't repeat what he said," she declared, and she hurried out through the open front door. I stood at the foot of the stairs, gazing up, wondering if she might be yanking my chain, or if she might be serious, when I heard heavy footsteps in the upper hallway, and then a creaking arose from the stairs, as though somebody was moving from one tread to the next. The landing at the head of the lower flight creaked, too, and made a cracking noise, as if an old board had splintered a little under a punishing weight. The shadows on the stairs were not so deep that they could have concealed anyone. Whoever descended toward me, if anyone did, was no more apparent to the eye than Claude Rains in that old movie The Invisible Man. Bad things happened to good people when invisible men or their equivalent were around. I quickly left the house, pulled the front door shut behind me, and joined Amalia as she descended the porch steps and hurried along the front walk. As we passed through the gate, I said, "What was that about?" "I don't want to talk about it now." "When do you want to talk about it?" "I'll let you know," she assured me as she turned toward home. I said, "I guess we'll have to eat those cookies ourselves." "Yeah, she doesn't want them with walnuts, and he doesn't want them with chocolate chips, and I don't think the new neighbor has any interest in cookies at all." "There isn't a new neighbor," Amalia declared, as we hurried alongside our house under the limbs of the twisted sycamore. "There's something," I said, glancing over the fence at the Clockenwall place. 4. Sitting in my room at the window, watching the house next door through a gap in the otherwise closed draperies, I tried to remember everything I knew about Rupert Clockenwall. He had taught English at Jefferson Middle School for 40 years. He was scheduled to retire at 62, but he died a month before the end of the school year. During his career, he twice received the city's Best Teacher of the Year award. He had never been married. Some people thought he might be gay, but he had never been seen in the company of a companion of that persuasion. Those were the days when people were ignorant enough to think that all gay men minced or lisped or both, and had no bones in their wrists. Mr. Clockenwall exhibited none of that behavior. He never went away on vacations. He said he was a bad traveler and a homebody. He always declined with regrets when he was invited to a neighbor's house, and to express his gratitude for the invitation, he sent flowers. He never spoke an unkind word about anyone. His voice was soft and melodious. He had a warm smile. He liked to putter in the yard, and he grew amazing roses. Around the house he favored hush-puppies, khaki slacks, and long-sleeved plaid shirts, cardigans on cooler days. He'd once found an injured bird and nursed it back to health, releasing it when it could fly again. He always bought Girl Scout cookies, usually 10 or 12 boxes. When the local troop sold magazine subscriptions, he bought a lot of those too, and when once they peddled hand-woven pot holders, he'd taken a dozen. He had a soft spot in his heart for Girl Scouts. He had no pets. He said that he was allergic to cats. Dogs frightened him. He stood about 5'9". He weighed maybe 160 pounds. Washed-out blue eyes, pale blonde hair going white. His face was no more memorable than a blank sheet of typing paper. Rupert Clockenwall seemed to have been too bland a soul to come back from the grave on a haunt. The more that I thought about what had happened in his house earlier, the more certain I became that I had misunderstood it. After an hour, when I saw nothing of interest through the gap in my bedroom draperies, I went downstairs to help Amalia with her chores. We worked together for half an hour, making the beds in our parents' room, using the vacuum cleaner, dusting, before I asked if she was ready to talk about what had happened. She said no. 40 minutes later, in the kitchen, after we had toted that barge and lifted that bale, as we were peeling carrots and potatoes for dinner, I asked her again, and she said, "Nothing happened." "Well, something did." Focused intently on the potato that she was skinning, Amalia said, "Something happened only if one or both of us insists it did. If both of us decide nothing happened, then nothing happened. You know what they say, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to see it, then it didn't fall. Okay, all right, I know that's not how it goes. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it, maybe it didn't make a sound. But my version is a logical corollary, entirely logical. No tree fell in the Clockenwall house, so there was nothing to hear or see. You're 12, so maybe that doesn't make sense to you. But when you've had a few more years of math and a course in logic, you'll understand. I don't want to talk about it." "If nothing happened, what is it you don't want to talk about?" "Exactly," she said. "Are you scared of something?" "There's nothing to be scared of. Nothing happened." Well, at least now we're talking about it, I said. She threw a ribbon of potato skin at me, and it stuck to my face, and I said, "Sibling abuse." And she said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." 5. That evening, after we washed and dried the dinner dishes, but before the old man could tell me to take it to the garage, I went out there with my saxophone, while Amalia sat at the kitchen table, being smoked at by our mother and made to appreciate the reasons for the dreadful inadequacy of the mashed potatoes that she had served with the roast chicken, even though both our parents had taken second helpings. I didn't start playing right away, but listened to some cool big band stuff. We had a cheap stereo in a corner of the garage and some records, including a number of vinyl platters from the 1930s that we'd found for next to nothing in a used record store. I was in the mood for the band called Andy Kirk and his Clouds of Joy. Several times during the 30s and early 1940s, they almost got famous, but never quite. Now, some 30 years later, I was a fan of their tenor saxist, Dick Wilson, and of Ted Donnelly, one of the best swing band trombonists ever, though it was Mary Lou Williams on piano that fully captivated me. I sat on a crate and let Froggy Bottom wash over me twice, and then walking and swinging, before Amalia arrived. We listened to Roll 'em, which Mary Lou Williams had written, as good as big band boogie-woogie gets. And when it was over, my always energetic sister wasn't jumping or finger-popping or in any way stoked by the music. She hadn't brought her clarinet. We weren't going to play together. I said, "What's wrong?" She stepped to the single small window which faced toward our deceased neighbor's house, and the distilled sunlight of that early June evening gilded her lovely face. "There was this time I was in the backyard, standing at the picnic table, working on an art project for school. I was really into it, and after a while I looked up and saw Clockenwall just the other side of the fence, staring at me. He was very intense. I said hi, and he didn't respond, and he had this look. It almost seemed like hatred, but it wasn't just that. The day was warm, I was wearing shorts and a tank top, and suddenly I felt as if I was naked. He wasn't anything like he'd always been before. He wasn't Teacher of the Year, that's for sure. He licked his lips. He made this huge production of licking them, staring at me so bold, I can't even describe how bold, with this need. Maybe there was hatred on his face, hatred and rage, but not entirely that, if you know what I mean. I knew what she meant, all right. "What did you do?" "I picked up my art supplies and took them inside." "You didn't tell anyone?" "I was too embarrassed to talk about it. Anyway, who was I going to tell? Dad was at work. When he comes home, he doesn't want anyone to get between him and that first beer. Mom was glued to afternoon game shows. I'd have rather put my hand in an alligator's mouth than distract her from Bill Cullen and The Price is Right." "You could have told me," I said. "That was 4 years ago. You were 8, sweetie. You didn't need to hear about something like that when you were only 8. "And you were only 13, I said. Man, what kind of creep was he? She turned from the garage window, and that square of golden sunshine backdropped her head. It happened again, about 6 months later. I took some trash out to the alleyway to put it in the can. He wasn't there at first, but when I turned to come back to the house, he was right behind me, like 3 feet away. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. But he did that lip-licking thing again, and he put one hand on his crotch. I dodged past him. He didn't reach for me or anything, and after that, nothing ever happened again. "I hate him," I declared. "I'm glad he's dead." She sat on a wheeled stool near the crate on which I perched, and she stared at her hands, which were clenched in her lap. "When we were over there today, I really heard him, Malcolm." "All right. I really did. He said, 'Sweet Melinda.' And then, when we were in the foyer, looking up the front stairs, he said my name. My name and something filthy." She raised her head and met my eyes. This was no hoax. I didn't know what to say. "Stay away from that house, Malcolm." "Why would I want to go there again?" "Stay away." "I will." "Are you kidding? I'm creeped out. Jeez." "I mean it. Stay away." "Well, you better stay away, too." "I intend to stay away," she said. "I know what I heard, and I never want to hear it again." "I didn't know you believed in ghosts," I said. "I didn't. I do now. Stay away." We sat in silence for a while. At last I said I needed to listen to something that would soothe away the heebie-jeebies, and instead of one of the old vinyl platters, I put an album on the turntable, a collection of Glenn Miller's best-known numbers. We liked rock and roll, but at heart, we were throwbacks to another musical era. Amalia listened to In the Mood, but just before the band swung into Moonlight Serenade, she said, "This isn't going to settle my nerves. I'm going to bed and read. I've got this novel." At the side door to the garage, she looked back and said, "Don't stay out here after dark." "I always stay here after dark." "But not tonight," she said. "Not for the next few nights." She was clearly frightened. I nodded. "Okay." After she had gone, I listened to Moonlight Serenade, and then to American Patrol, after which I lifted the phonograph needle and returned it to the beginning of the album. As In the Mood began, I left the garage and went into the alleyway. About 40 minutes of daylight remained. I walked to the back gate of the Clockenwall property. 6. I was not a particularly brave lad of 12. I well knew my limitations, and I was aware that if I ever got into a fight with another boy, I was less likely to beat him up than I was to knock myself out. In a confrontation with something supernatural, I would not fare well against any adversary more threatening than Casper the Friendly Ghost. Nevertheless, I was compelled to cross the backyard of the Clockenwall place and climb the steps to the rear porch, because I loved my sister more than I loved myself, and I felt that it had fallen to me somehow to resolve this bizarre situation. I had never seen Amalia a fraction as disturbed as she had been when telling me about the lecherous teacher. She was fearless and resolute and more competent than anyone else I had ever known. I was loath to see her diminished by fear, and I was angered and depressed when I thought of her retreating to her bedroom and hiding behind a book, because that's what it seemed to me she was doing, although I would never have told her so. When I crossed the porch of the Clockenwall house, I was not surprised to find the back door ajar, as the front door had been earlier. Stepping into the kitchen, where less sunlight penetrated than previously, I boldly switched on the overhead lights. If the spirit of a dead man had returned home a month after his funeral, there was no way to prowl his house without his knowledge. I mean, surely a ghost is omniscient as concerns what happens in the place that it haunts. The dish smeared with dry egg yolk and the dirty flatware were on the table, across which toast crumbs were scattered as before. Clockenwall had not returned to clean up after himself. Switching on lights, I went through the house to the front stairs, where something invisible to the eye had earlier descended. Facing the first flight, I stood listening, but there was only silence so deep that the house might not have been located in the city any longer, might have been enveloped by some bubble in space-time and set adrift in eternity. At last I thought to ask myself what I hoped to accomplish in that place. I wasn't an exorcist. My family didn't even attend a church. My parents weren't atheists. They were just indifferent to the issues of God and an afterlife, as they were indifferent to everything except what could be eaten, drunk, smoked, and watched on television without inspiring too much thinking. I had no good answer to the question that I'd asked myself. Therefore, with what passed for logic in a 12-year-old mind, I decided that I had been brought to that place by intuition, and that I should trust it, as a dog trusted its sense of smell. When suddenly I heard a rapid pounding, I cringed and retreated from the staircase. but only until I realized that I had become aware of my heart drumming. Disappointed in myself, chagrined, I thrust my shoulders back and lifted my head, and, telling myself the incredible lie that the Pomerantz family tree branched broadly with generations of warriors, I ascended to the second floor. One of the good things about being 12 or younger is that you tend to believe that you'll live forever. Therefore, you take stupid risks with little hesitation, and sometimes the risk pays off, except when it doesn't. Upstairs, door by door, room by room, I searched for what I did not know, trusting my intuition to lead me to some revelation, some knowledge or instrument with which Clockenwall's spirit could be sent back where it belonged, if in fact it had returned from the other side to leer at my sister. In the Teacher of the Year's bedroom stood a desk where someone else might have put a vanity, and I was drawn toward it as an iron filing to a magnet. Then a disturbing thing happened. With no memory of having sat down or of having opened any of the drawers, I was in the desk chair and had before me a scrapbook containing newspaper articles about a girl named Melinda Lee Harmony. Sweet Melinda. She'd been a middle school student who, 3 months before her 13th birthday, disappeared while walking home after classes. Some of the clippings were dated, all from 1949, 18 years earlier. I pored through them with growing dread, but I couldn't stop turning pages, as though I had forfeited control of my body. The police, assisted by a large contingent of citizen volunteers, had searched the school grounds, surrounding neighborhoods, and Balfour Park, which lay along the route that the girl usually took from school to home. They found no trace of her. A reward was offered, never claimed. Members of her anguished family, her pastor, and a few teachers at her school spoke highly of her, this gentle and intelligent and charming child of great promise. One of the teachers was Rupert Clockenwall. 3 photographs had been provided to the newspapers, all taken soon before she had gone missing. She had been a pretty girl, blonde and slim, with a gamine smile, and as I stared at her, I heard myself say, "Such a delectable little tease." 7. I had no recollection of having put aside the scrapbook, or of taking a thick diary from another desk drawer. As I paged through this new volume, in an almost dreamlike state, in the grip of cold fear but unable to act upon it, I saw that in handwriting of almost machine-like neatness and consistency, Clockenwall had recorded the events of Melinda Lee Harmony's captivity, beginning on the day he'd offered her a ride home until, I was compelled to page forward, the day that he killed her, 17 months later. This was a journal that celebrated depravity, and in the entries that passed before my eyes, he regretted nothing except killing her, lamenting the sudden loss of control during which lust and violence had become for him one and the same thing. I heard myself say, "Such a waste, such a pity. She was still so useful." Again, I had no awareness of putting that volume aside, or of retrieving from the desk another scrapbook, this one of more recent vintage. In it were articles clipped from the student newspaper at the middle school that Amalia had attended, the school where Rupert Clockenwall had taught English. They were poems and little stories that she had written for that publication. He had somehow obtained her 7th, 8th, and 9th grade class photos. I noticed the silver cross on a chain around her neck, which she had taken to wearing in those days, but no longer wore. There were as well photos taken with a telephoto lens. A younger Amalia sitting on the front porch, standing in the backyard, going to and from the garage that was her safe harbor and mine. Clockenwall seemed to have stopped adding to the scrapbook when my sister was 15, and as I came to the blank pages that he had never used, I heard myself say, without intention or control, "A tasty little piece of tale, but too close to home, too risky. Didn't dare. Didn't dare. I wish I had." With no recollection of getting up from the desk, leaving the bedroom and descending the front stairs, I found myself in the kitchen. I was holding a filleting knife. 8. I tried to throw down the knife, but instead gripped it more tightly than ever. If I was in terror of leaving that house and going home with some unthinkable purpose, I don't recall. I remained in a dreamlike state as I crossed the kitchen to an inner door, opened it, switched on the cellar lights, and went down the steep stairs to that lower realm. In that windowless place, entirely below ground, with its block walls and earthen floor, I found a small wooden table and 2 chairs, as well as a bookcase containing volumes suitable for a girl 12 going on 13, stories of horses and romance and adventure. On the floor lay a stained and moldering mattress, and in the concrete block wall above it was fixed a ring bolt, from which trailed a chain and manacle. In the corner near the furnace, I stood swaying, gazing down at the hard-packed earth, from which had over time fluoresced both bright white and yellowish crystals finer than salt in patterns that were vaguely reminiscent of voodoo vevés. Now Clockenwall shared with me his images, memories, of burying the murdered girl in a deep bed of powdered lime to facilitate decomposition and to control the odor. In my mind's eye, I saw him tamping a layer of soil atop the lime, weeping as he worked, weeping not for the girl, but for the loss of his toy. Melinda had been in her grave for so many years that no foul odor lingered. I looked up from the floor and stared at the knife, wondering for what purpose he had made me take it from a kitchen drawer. Upstairs, Amalia called my name. 9. Wide-eyed, wondering, Amalia came down the cellar stairs, her footfalls echoing hollowly off the plank treads. The novel that she had been reading failed to engage her, and she couldn't be distracted from thinking about the voice that had spoken to her in this house earlier. As twilight approached, she had looked out of her window and had seen the Clockenwall house filled with light once more. "I went to the garage," she said. "You weren't there, but an album was playing, and I just knew where I'd find you. It's my fault you came here. I mean, what are you going to do when I tell you to stay away from this place, you being 12 and a boy and careening toward puberty? You're brave, okay? But we should get out of here." She had glanced at the mattress as she came off the stairs, but the horror of it registered with her only on second glance, when she seemed to see the ring bolt, the chain, and the manacle for the first time. Yet surely she couldn't fully understand what had happened here. Maybe she'd never heard of Melinda Harmony, who had been kidnapped a year before Amalia was born. Remembering Mr. Clockenwall's creepy interest in her, however, my very bright sister seemed to deduce that the chain and the manacle were evidence of imprisonment, and that the filthy mattress had served not merely as a place of rest. The color drained from her face, although when she turned her attention to me once more, she seemed perplexed, but not afraid. Desperate, suddenly breaking into a sweat, I tried to tell her to run, but I was denied my voice. "Malcolm? What have you found? What's happened here?" "Delicious memories," I said, and though the voice I heard was mine, I was not the one who had spoken. I had been standing with the knife held down at my side, against my leg. Now she saw it. "Sweetie, what are you doing with a knife?" She looked toward the furnace, into darker corners of the cellar. "Is someone here? Are you in danger?" Moving toward her, I heard my voice declare, "If I'd seen you first, I never would have bothered with the other girl." Amalia's eyes widened further, and she backed away from me. At the head of the stairs, the door slammed shut. I figured that if she could get to the top of the steps ahead of me, the door would prove to be locked. She was my sister, beloved, who had stayed in my room around the clock when I'd been 8 and suffered with a case of the flu that nearly killed me. She was my sister, whose clarinet playing inspired me to find the music in me, to settle on the saxophone, which had fast become the key to my identity. I loved her as I loved no one else, as no others had allowed me to love them, and if I were to kill her under the influence of some malign spirit, I might as well then kill myself. I was the one who lumbered and stumbled through life, who lacked physical grace. But in this case, Amalia was the one who misstepped, fell backward, and sat hard on the third step as I raised the knife. Her green eyes were as deep as an Arctic sea, shining with cold fear, sudden terror. As the knife reached the apex of its arc, I saw around her neck the silver cross that she had worn in middle school, but never since. She must have put it on before leaving our house, as if she'd known that she would not find me in the garage, that once again she would have to enter this hateful place. As the knife came down, I realized that she had bought the tiny silver cross on the silver chain and had begun wearing it when she'd been 13, after the first time she'd caught Rupert Clockenwall staring at her, the day that she'd been in our backyard working on the art project. She must have wanted to ward off his evil, to feel protected in this world where none of us is ever truly safe. Down came the knife, with less force than Clockenwall wanted, with a different target than he intended. When the blade thrust deep into my thigh, I screamed, and with the scream, I cast him out. A shriek ricocheted from wall to wall, issuing neither from me nor from Amalia, and in that windowless room, where a mere draught would have had no source, there sprang up not just a draught, but a wind, cold on that summer night, turning around the cellar, spinning up dust and the soft white and yellow crystals that marked the grave, a wind that was the embodiment of inhuman rage. I tore the knife from my thigh, threw it down, dropped to one knee, bleeding, but not yet in pain, clamping one hand over the wound. Amalia came to her feet as the wind seemed to gather itself into a battering ram, whereupon it slammed into her with such velocity, such force, that the rubber band holding her ponytail snapped, and her blonde tresses stood on end as if she were a candle and her hair the flame. I thought that she would be lifted off her feet, and the pendant stood straight out from her to the length of the chain, as though it would be torn from her and blown away. She seized it with one hand and held it to her throat. Then I heard again the sound that had awakened me and drawn me to my window the previous night, when all this began, a sound like steel stropping steel. As before, it came 3 times, but now it sounded less like a sword drawn from a scabbard than like some great metal door scraping open across a threshold. The roaring, whistling wind seemed to blow away through that unseen door, and the cellar fell quiet, still, all dust drifting toward the floor. Because Amalia always was as resilient as she was strong as she was smart, she knelt beside me, and wasting no time exclaiming about what we had just witnessed, she said, "Your leg, the wound, let me see." Blood had streamed between my fingers, darkened the leg of my slacks, spattered the floor, but when I took my hand away from the wound, my trousers were not ripped. In wonder, I raised my hand and saw that the blood dripping from it a moment earlier was nowhere to be seen. The pants were no longer stained, the floor without a single crimson spatter. The blade of the knife gleamed, as clean as if it had just been washed. I got to my feet, physically as whole as I had been before I entered that house. Amalia rose too, and met my eyes, and neither of us could speak. She put her arms around me, and I hugged her, and after a while we went up the stairs to the kitchen. Together we went through the quiet house, turning out the lights that I had left on. Before we departed, I showed her the scrapbook about Melinda Lee Harmony, the diary, and the scrapbook to the pages of which her own middle school class photos had been fixed with Scotch tape. Still, neither of us spoke. We had no need to put our recent experience into words, for we understood the meaning of it in our hearts. We closed the door, descended the porch steps. Night took the last purple from the sky as we crossed Clockenwall's backyard. At the rear gate, Amalia said, So the Glenn Miller stuff didn't soothe your nerves. I said, I should have played a Guy Lombardo album. 10. We didn't want to go back into that house ever again. We didn't want to talk about what had happened there or be questioned about it. Using a typewriter in a research room at the public library, my sister wrote a letter to the police, reporting in some detail what they would find in the Clockenwall residence. She made sure that she wiped all fingerprints from the paper and envelope before mailing it at a post office 12 blocks from our house. Maybe they thought the letter was a hoax, but they had to check it out. The story was a sensation for a week, which was a long time in a year when the news was full of big stories about war in Vietnam and race riots in America's cities. Having found the scrapbook devoted to Amalia, the police came by to speak to her, and she told them how Mr. Clockenwall had spooked her on those 2 occasions when she was 13. But she said not a word regarding our adventure. Perhaps because she never lied and had about her a palpable air of truthfulness, they never thought to ask if she had recently been inside the house of murder, or if she might be the one who had written the letter. I do not believe the cops were careless or incompetent in their investigation. What I think is, because of Amalia's great good heart and the purity of her gentle soul, some power that watches over us ensured that she would be spared the ordeal of being the object of a media frenzy. She and I never again spoke of those events. There was nothing that needed to be said, for we understood and accepted. Occasionally, however, my sister came to me and hugged me tightly for the longest time, and although she seemed to have no reason for doing so, we both knew the reason. As I said, that was the summer when I met Jonah Kirk, who became my best friend for life, who loved Amalia as if she were his sister too, and who has written so well of her in his book, The City. During the months thereafter, far more happened to us than we, at our most imaginative, could have foreseen, all of it different in character from what I've just told you here, with more wonder and delight, with no evil spirits, but with worse. For years the Clockenwall house remained for sale, but no one would purchase it. When eventually it sold, the buyer tore it down and, with the city's permission, converted the property into a pocket park, with a fountain where birds bathe, and with benches where people sit to watch them and to rest from the stresses of the day. On the granite base of the fountain, a plaque bears only the name Melinda Lee Harmony, which means to say that she didn't truly die on that ground, but lives there forever.
Okay, that marks the end of our second story of the evening. We have one more to go. It's a pretty short one. It's only a half hour long, but we're still going to have a 10-minute break before that. So see you in 10 minutes with A Short Guide to the City by Peter Straub. Okay, we're back. This next story is called A Short Guide to the City. It's by Peter Straub. This story is a bit more abstract in the sense that it has no real plot and no tangible characters that experience any sort of development. It's more a story about the spirit or the energy that a place like a city contains when it's regarded as its own entity. It's really a sort of series of vignettes or like a bunch of zooms in and out of little things happening across a wide area. So it's a neat story. I like it. So let's listen.
A Short Guide to the City. The Viaduct Killer, named for the location where his victims' bodies have been discovered, is still at large. There have been 6 victims to date, found by children, people exercising their dogs, lovers, or, in one instance, by policemen. The bodies lay sprawled, their throats slashed, partially sheltered by one or another of the massive concrete supports at the top of the slope beneath the Great Bridge. We assume that the Viaduct Killer is a resident of the city, a voter, a renter or property owner, a product of the city's excellent public school system, perhaps even a parent of children who even now attend one of its 7 elementary schools, 3 public high schools, 2 parochial schools, or single non-denominational private school. He may own a boat or belong to the Book of the Month Club. He may frequent one or another of its many bars and taverns. He may have subscription tickets to the concert series put on by the City Symphony Orchestra. He may be a factory worker with a library ticket. He owns a car, perhaps 2. He may swim in one of the city's public pools or the vast lake, punctuated with sailboats during the hot, moist August of the city. For this is a Midwestern city, northern, with violent changes of season. The extremes of climate, from 10 or 20 below zero to up around 100 in the summer, cultivate an attitude of acceptance in its citizens, of insularity. It looks inward, not out, and few of its children leave for the more temperate, uncertain, and experimental cities of the eastern or western coasts. The city is proud of its modesty. It cherishes the ordinary, or what it sees as the ordinary, which is not. It has had the same mayor for 24 years, a man of limited to average intelligence who has aged gracefully and has never had any other occupation of any sort. Ambition, the yearning for fame, position, and achievement, is discouraged here. One of its citizens became the head of a small foreign state, another a famous band leader, yet another a Hollywood staple who for decades played the part of the star's best friend and confidant. This, it is felt, is enough, and besides, all of these people are now dead. The city has no literary tradition. Its only mirror is provided by its 2 newspapers, which have thick sports sections and are comfortable enough to be read in bed. The city's characteristic mode is denial. For this reason, an odd fabulousness permeates every quarter of the city, a receptiveness to fable, to the unrecorded. A river runs through the center of the business district, as the Liffey runs through Dublin, the Seine through Paris, the Thames through London, and the Danube through Budapest. Though our river is smaller and less consequential than any of these. Our lives are ordinary and exemplary, the citizens would say. We take part in the life of the nation. History courses through us for all our immunity to the national illnesses. It is even possible that in our ordinary lives, we, too, have had our pulse taken by the great national seers and opinion makers, for in us you may find. 40 years ago, in winter, the body of a woman was found on the banks of the river. She had been raped and murdered, cast out of the human community, a prostitute, never identified, and the noises of struggle that must have accompanied her death went unnoticed by the patrons of the Green Woman tap room located directly above that point on the river where her body was discovered. It was an abnormally cold winter that year, a winter of shared misery, and within the Green Woman the music was loud, feverish, festive. In that community, which is Irish and lives above its riverfront shops and bars, neighborhood children were supposed to have found a winged man huddling in a packing case, an aged man, half-starved, speaking a strange language none of the children knew. His wings were ragged and dirty, many of the feathers as cracked and threadbare as those of an old pigeon's, and his feet were dirty and swollen. "Ol Lee Gak!" the children screamed at him, mocking the sounds that came from his mouth. They pelted him with rocks and snowballs, imagining that he had crawled up from that same river which sent chill damp, a damp as cold as cancer, into their bones and bedrooms, which gave them earaches and chilblains, which in summer bred rats and mosquitoes. One of the city's newspapers is Democratic, the other Republican. Both papers ritually endorse the mayor, who, though consummately political, has no recognizable politics. Both of the city's newspapers also support the chief of police, crediting him with keeping the city free of the kind of violence that has undermined so many other American cities. None of our citizens goes armed, and our church attendance is still far above the national average. We are ambivalent about violence. We have very few public statues, mostly of Civil War generals. On the lakefront, separated from the rest of the town by a 6-lane expressway, stands the cube-like structure of the Arts Center, otherwise called the War Memorial. Its rooms are hung with mediocre paintings before which school children are led on tours by their teachers, most of whom were educated in our local school system. Our teachers are satisfied, decent people, and the statistics about alcohol and drug abuse among both students and teachers are very encouraging. There is no need to linger at the War Memorial. Proceeding directly north, you soon find yourself among the orderly, impressive precincts of the wealthy. It was in this sector of the town, known generally as the East Side, that the brewers and tanners who made our city's first great fortunes set up their mansions. Their houses have a northern, Germanic, even Baltic look, which is entirely appropriate to our climate. Of gray stone or red brick, the size of factories or prisons, these stately buildings seem to conceal that vein of fantasy that is actually our most crucial inheritance. But it may be that the style of life, the invisible, hidden life of these inbred merchants, is itself fantastic. The multitude of servants, the maids and coachmen, the cooks and laundresses, the private zoos, the elaborate dynastic marriages and fleets of cars, the rooms lined with silk wallpaper, the 20-course meals, the underground wine cellars and bomb shelters. Of course, we do not know if all of these things are true, or even if some of them are true. Our society folk keep to themselves, and what we know of them we learn chiefly from the newspapers, where they are pictured at their balls, standing with their beautiful daughters before fountains of champagne. The private zoos have been broken up long ago. As citizens, we are free to walk down the avenues past the magnificent houses and to peer in through the gates at their coach houses and lawns. A uniformed man polishes a car. 4 tall young people in white play tennis on a private court. The viaduct killer's victims have all been adult women. While you continue moving north, you will find that as the houses diminish in size, the distance between them grows greater. Through the houses, now without gates and coach houses, you can glimpse a sheet of flat grayish blue, the lake. The air is free. You breathe it in. That is freedom, breathing this air from the lake. Free people may invent themselves in any image, and you may imagine yourself a prince of the earth, walking with an easy stride. Your table is set with linen, china, crystal, and silver, and as you dine, as the servants pass among you with the serving trays, the talk is educated, enlightened, without prejudice of any sort. The table talk is mainly about ideas, it is true, ideas of a conservative cast. You deplore violence. You do not recognize it. Further north lie suburbs, which are uninteresting. If from the War Memorial you proceed south, you cross the viaduct. Beneath you is a valley. The valley is perhaps best seen in the dead of winter. All of our city welcomes winter, for our public buildings are gray stone fortresses which, on days when the temperature dips below zero and the old gray snow of previous storms swirls in the avenues, seem to blend with the leaden air and become dreamlike and cloudy. This is how they were meant to be seen. The valley is called the valley. Red flames tilt and waver at the tops of columns, and smoke pours from factory chimneys. The trees seem to be black. In the winter, the smoke from the factories becomes solid, like dark gray glaciers, and hangs in the dark air in defiance of gravity, like wings that are a light feathery gray at their tips and darken imperceptibly toward black, toward pitchy black at the point where these great frozen glaciers, these dirigibles, would join the body at the shoulder. The bodies of the great birds to which these wings are attached must be imagined. In the old days of the city, the time of the private zoos, wolves were bred in the valley. Wolves were in great demand in those days. Now the wolf ranches have been entirely replaced by factories, by rough taverns owned by retired shop foremen, by spurs of the local railroad line, and by narrow streets lined with rickety frame houses and shoe repair shops. Most of the old wolf breeders were Polish, and though their kennels, grassy yards, and barbed wire exercise runs have disappeared, at least one memory of their existence endures. The valley's street signs are in the Polish language. Tourists are advised to skirt the valley, and it is always recommended that photographs be confined to the interesting views obtained by looking down from the viaduct. The more courageous visitors, those in search of pungent experience, are cautiously directed to the taverns of the ex-foreman, in particular the oldest of these, the Rusty Nail and the Brace and Bit, where the wooden floors have so softened and furred with lavings and scrubbings that the boards have come to resemble the pelts of long, narrow, short-haired animals. For the intrepid, these words of caution: do not dress conspicuously, and carry only small amounts of cash. Some working knowledge of Polish is also advised. Continuing further south, we come to the Polish district proper, which also houses pockets of Estonians and Lithuanians. More than the city's sadly declining downtown area, this district has traditionally been regarded as the city's heart, and has remained unchanged for more than 100 years. Here the visitor may wander freely among the markets and street fairs, delighting in the sight of well-bundled children rolling hoops, patriarchs in tall fur hats and long beards, and women gathering around the numerous communal water pumps. The sausages and stuffed cabbage sold at the food stalls may be eaten with impunity, and the local beer is said to be of an unrivaled purity. Violence in this district is invariably domestic, and the visitor may feel free to enter the frequent political discussions, which in any case partake of a nostalgic character. In late January or early February, the South Side is at its best, with the younger people dressed in multi-layered heavy woolen garments decorated with the reindeer or snowflake motif, and the older women of the community seemingly vying to see which of them can outdo the others in the thickness, blackness, and heaviness of her outer garments, and in the severity of the traditional headscarf known as the babushka. In late winter, the neatness and orderliness of these colorful folk may be seen at its best, for the wandering visitor will often see the bearded paterfamilias sweeping and shoveling not only his immaculate bit of sidewalk, for these houses are as close together as those of the wealthy along the lakefront, so near to one another that until very recently telephone service was regarded as an irrelevance, but his tiny front lawn as well, with its Marian shrines, creches, ornamental objects such as elves, trolls, postboys, etc. It is not unknown for residents here to proffer the stranger an invitation to inspect their houses, in order to display the immaculate condition of the kitchen with its well-blackened wood stove and polished ornamental tiles, and perhaps even extend a thimble glass of their own peach or plum brandy to the thirsty visitor. Alcohol, with its associations of warmth and comfort, is ubiquitous here, and it is the rare family that does not devote some portion of the summer to the preparation of that winter's plenty. For these people, violence is an internal matter, to be resolved within or exercised upon one's own body and soul or those of one's immediate family. The inhabitants of these neat, scrubbed little houses with their statues of Mary and cathedral tiles, the descendants of the hard-drinking wolf breeders of another time, have long since abandoned the practice of crippling their children to ensure their continuing exposure to parental values, but self-mutilation has proved more difficult to eradicate. Few blind themselves now, but many a grandfather conceals a three-fingered hand within his embroidered mitten. Toes are another frequent target of self-punishment, and the prevalence of cheerful, even boisterous shops, always crowded with old men telling stories which sell the hand-carved wooden legs known as pegs or dollies, speaks of yet another. No one has ever suggested that the Viaduct Killer is a South Side resident. The Southsiders live in a profound relationship to violence, and its effects are invariably implosive rather than explosive. Once a decade, perhaps twice a decade, one member of a family will realize, out of what depths of cultural necessity the outsider can only hope to imagine, that the whole family must die, be sacrificed, to speak with greater accuracy. Axes, knives, bludgeons, bottles, babushkas, ancient derringers, virtually every imaginable implement has been used to carry out this aim. The houses in which this act of sacrifice has taken place are immediately, if not instantly, cleaned by the entire neighborhood, acting in concert. The bodies receive a Catholic burial in consecrated ground, and a mass is said in honor of both the victims and their murderer. A picture of the departed family is installed in the church which abuts Market Square, and for a year the house is kept clean and dust-free by the grandmothers of the neighborhood. Men, young and old, will quietly enter the house, sip the brandy of the removed, as they are called, meditate, now and then switch on the wireless or the television set, and reflect on the darkness of earthly life. The departed are frequently said to appear to friends and neighbors, and often accurately predict the coming of storms and assist in the location of lost household objects, a treasured button or mother's sewing needle. After the year has elapsed, the house is sold, most often to a young couple, a young blacksmith or market vendor and his bride, who find the furniture and even the clothing of the removed welcome additions to their small household. Further south are suburbs and impoverished hamlets, which do not compel a visit. Immediately west of the war memorial is the city's downtown. Before its decline, this was the city's business district and administrative center, and the monuments of its affluence remain. Marching directly west on the wide avenue which begins at the expressway are the Federal Building, the Post Office, and the great edifice of City Hall. Each is an entire block long and constructed of granite blocks quarried far north in the state. Flights of marble stairs lead up to the massive doors of these structures, and crystal chandeliers can be seen through many of the windows. The facades are classical and severe, uniting in an architectural landscape of granite revetments and colonnades of pillars. Within, these grand and inhuman buildings have long ago been carved and partitioned into warrens illuminated by bare light bulbs or flickering fluorescent tubing. Each tiny office with its worn counter for petitioners and a stamped sign proclaiming its function: tax and excise, dog licenses, passports, graphs and charts, registry of notary publics, and the like. The larger rooms with chandeliers which face the avenue, reserved for civic receptions and banquets, are seldom used. In the next sequence of buildings are the Hall of Records, the police headquarters, and the Criminal Courts Building. Again, wide, empty marble steps lead up to massive bronze doors, rows of columns, glittering windows which on wintry days reflect back the gray, empty sky. Local craftsmen, many of them descendants of the city's original French settlers, forged and installed the decorative iron bars and grills on the facade of the Criminal Courts Building. After we pass the massive, nearly windowless brick facades of the gas and electric buildings, we reach the arching metal drawbridge over the river. Looking downriver, we can see its muddy banks and the lights of the terrace of the Green Woman Tap Room, now a popular gathering place for the city's civil servants. A few feet further east is the spot from which a disgruntled lunatic attempted and failed to assassinate President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Further on stand the high cement walls of several breweries. The drawbridge has not been raised since 1956, when a corporate yacht passed through. Beyond the drawbridge lies the old mercantile center of the city, with its adult bookstores, pornographic theaters, coffee shops, and its ranks of old department stores. These now house discount outlets selling roofing tiles, mufflers, and other auto parts, plumbing equipment, and cut-rate clothing, and most of their display windows have been boarded or bricked in since the civic disturbances of 1968. Various civic plans have failed to revive this area, though the cobblestones and gas street lamps installed in the optimistic mid-70s can, for the most part, still be seen. Connoisseurs of the poignant will wish to take a moment to appreciate them, though they should seek to avoid the bands of ragged children that frequent this area at nightfall. For though these children are harmless, they can become pressing in their pleas for small change. Many of these children inhabit dwellings they have constructed themselves in the vacant lots between the adult bookstores and fast food outlets of the old mercantile district, and the tree houses atop mounds of tires, most of them several stories high and utilizing fire escapes and flights of stairs scavenged from the old department stores, are of some architectural interest. The stranger should not attempt to penetrate these children's cities, and on no account should offer them any more than the pocket change they request, or display a camera, jewelry, or an expensive wristwatch. The truly intrepid tourist seeking excitement may hire one of these children to guide him to the diversions of his choice. $2 is the usual gratuity for this service. It is not advisable to purchase any of the goods the children themselves may offer for sale, although they have been affected by the same self-consciousness evident in the impressive buildings on the other side of the river and do sell picture postcards of their largest and most eccentric constructions. It may be that the naive architecture of these tree houses represents the city's most authentic artistic expression, and the postcards, amateurish as most of them are, provide interesting, perhaps even valuable documentation of this expression of what may be called folk art. These industrious children of the mercantile area have ritualized their violence into highly formalized tattooing and spontaneous forays and raids into the tree houses of opposing tribes, during which only superficial injuries are sustained, and it is not suspected that the viaduct killer comes from their number. Further west are the remains of the city's museum and library, devastated during the civic disturbances, and beyond these picturesque, still-smoking hulls lies the ghetto. It is not advised to enter the ghetto on foot, though the tourist who has arranged to rent an automobile may safely drive through it after he has negotiated his toll at the gatehouse. The ghetto's residents are completely self-sustaining, and the attentive tourist who visits this district will observe the multitude of tents housing hospitals, wholesale food and drug warehouses, and the like. Within the ghetto are believed to be many fine poets, painters, and musicians, as well as the historians known as memorists, who are the district's living encyclopedias and archivists. The memorists' tasks include the memorization of the works of the area's poets, painters, etc., for the district contains no printing presses or art supply shops, and these inventive and self-reliant people have devised this method of preserving their works. It is not believed that a people capable of inventing the genre of oral painting could have spawned the viaduct killer, and in any case, no ghetto resident is permitted access to any other area of the city. The ghetto's relationship to violence is unknown. Further west, the annual snowfall increases greatly, for 7 months of the year dropping an average of 2.3 feet of snow each month upon the shopping malls and paper mills which have concentrated here. Dust storms are common during the summers, and certain infectious viruses, to which the inhabitants have become immune, are carried in the water. Still further west lies the sports complex. The tourist who has ventured thus far is well advised to turn back at this point and return to our beginning, the War Memorial. Your car may be left in the ample and clearly posted parking lot on the memorial's eastern side. From the memorial's wide, empty terraces, you are invited to look southeast, where a great unfinished bridge crosses half the span to the hamlets of Wyatt and Arnoldville. Construction was abandoned on this noble civic project, subsequently imitated by many cities in our western states and in Australia and Finland, immediately after the disturbances of 1968, when its lack of utility became apparent. When it was noticed that many families chose to eat their bag lunches on the memorial's lakeside terraces in order to gaze silently at its great interrupted arc, the bridge was adopted as the symbol of the city, and its image decorates the city's many flags and medals. The broken span, as it is called, which hangs in the air like the great frozen wings above the valley, serves no function but the symbolic. In itself, and entirely by accident, this great non-span memorializes violence, not only by serving as a reference to the workmen who lost their lives during its construction, its non-construction. It is not rounded or finished in any way, for labor on the bridge ended abruptly, even brutally, and from its truncated floating end dangle lengths of rusting iron webbing, thick wire cables weighted by chunks of cement, and bits of old planking material. In the days before access to the unbridge was walled off by an electrified fence, 2 or 3 citizens each year elected to commit their suicides by leaping from the end of the span, and one must resort to a certain lexical violence when referring to it. Ghetto residents are said to have named it Whitey, and the treehouse children call it Ursula, after one of their own killed in the disturbances. Southsiders refer to it as the Ghost, civil servants the Beast, and Eastsiders simply as that thing. The broken span has the violence of all unfinished things, of everything interrupted or left undone. In violence there is often the quality of yearning, the yearning for completion, for closure, for that which is absent and would, if present, bring to fulfillment, for the body without which the wing is a useless frozen ornament. It ought not to go unmentioned that most of the city's residents have never seen the bridge except in its representations, and for this majority the bridge is little more or less than a myth, being without any actual referent. It is pure idea. Violence, it is felt, though unspoken, is the physical form of sensitivity. The city believes this. In completion, the lack of referent which strands you in the realm of pure idea demands release from itself. We are, above all, an American city, and what we believe most deeply The victims of the viaduct killer, that citizen who excites our attention, who makes us breathless with outrage and causes our police force to ransack the humble dwellings along the riverbank, have all been adult women. These women in their middle years are taken from their lives and set like statues beside the pillar. Each morning there is more pedestrian traffic on the viaduct. In the frozen mornings, men, mainly men, come with their lunches in paper bags, walking slowly along the cement walkway, not looking at one another, barely knowing what they are doing, looking down over the edge of the viaduct, looking away, dawdling, finally leaning like fishermen against the railing, waiting until they can no longer delay going to their jobs. The visitor who has done so much and gone so far in this city may turn his back on the broken span, the focus of civic pride, and look in a southwesterly direction past the 6 lanes of the expressway, perhaps on tiptoe. Children may have to mount one of the convenient retaining walls. The dull flanks of the viaduct should just now be visible, with the heads and shoulders of the waiting men picked out in the gray air like brushstrokes. The quality of their yearning, its expectancy, is visible even from here.
All right, and that is the end of story time for tonight. Come back tomorrow night around the same time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. EST, and we will listen to a story by Stephen King, as well as another one from our boy Peter Straub. I strongly encourage you guys to rewatch the VODs of these videos sometime without having the chat replay on screen. That way you'll definitely find the stories much more immersive and easy to follow on your second listen. The only other thing I want to say before I go is that I think we're going to do this type of thing around the first weekend of each month from now on. So the next Storytime weekend will take place sometime around October 4th or 5th. In the meantime, though, I will see you guys tomorrow.